Somewhere in the hot part of the country, up in Queensland, one of our favourite guests talking about stuff in the workplace, Anton Guinea. Good morning and welcome back.
Robert Cameron, always a pleasure to join your listeners. It's a privilege to talk to them. It's a privilege to be interviewed by Australia's number one.
Oh, mate, you're going to get on in this town of Geelong. Get yourself down here if you're going to keep talking like that.
Can I?
Yeah, please do. You probably wouldn't want to leave your weather, though. What have you got today, 25 or something?
Yeah, something. I think 6 or something. Only in summer. If I can come down then, that'd be pretty cool.
It would be like your winter, our summer. Hey, mate, there's a little thing that I always like to have a particular subject matter, and we've had an issue down here in Victoria that hasn't seemed to have got its way up to you, and that is some pretty ordinary behaviour from one union on work sites in Victoria. But we're also seeing that people on the opposite side, the employers and government officials, have a lot to say. It looks like a little bit of a system that everyone at the top of the tree wins out, and the ones that don't win out are the workers. Just the relationship generally with unions compared to when we were young, and I'm a bit older than you, but back in the day there was constantly big strikes around Easter and Christmas with fuel companies and beer makers and the like. But we have a pretty relaxed and balanced workplace regarding disputes these days, it would seem. What's it like up your neck of the woods?
Look, I can remember, as you can, Robert, I can remember being an apprentice in the 1990s, and in the early 90s, apprentices were never in the unions, but I used to love the unions because the tradespeople would always be on strike. And then someone had to be there, and even though as electrical apprentices we weren't allowed to really do anything by ourselves, but the company allowed us to stay back and work overtime. So we all got extra overtime as young humans back then, even though we really couldn't do much, and we were okay with that. But for the people that were around that weren't involved in the strike action, we could help out. And so, and I was, raised very, very union focused, and I saw the benefits of unions. And so then I moved to WA to an organisation that had what was called, and I hope this doesn't offend any of your listeners, the first workplace agreements in WA, where there was no union involvement, whereas a conversation between the employee and the employer, and you had a negotiation process. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And so I've sort of seen very much in my whole working life, because I've worked on sites that are very unionised, and I've worked on sites that aren't unionised. And it's interesting. And I listened to your conversation then about CFMEU, and I did some research, and I can see what's sort of going down on your neck of the woods. And we actually, like up here, strike action is probably very downplayed, I'd say, in Queensland. Like, some organisations do still strike, and it happens, but a lot of the time it doesn't make the news. Like, it doesn't seem to be as media worthy as it is in Victoria. Like, I've done some work with some Victorian companies, and that's the first conversation. It's, you've got to be careful, how you say what you do. We're very unionised. Okay, that's okay. Cool. Because I am careful with my languaging, and I won't ever potentially, well, I do occasionally, but I'm really careful with how I articulate things. So I really get that dichotomy between, say, Victorian unions and Queensland unions. But it is a really interesting thing to talk about it, because you and I have done some research, which I love, just about how union action, strike action, has changed through the years.
I don't know how long you got to get along using words like dichotomy on this. This is, I'm an old shearer, Anton. Go a bit easy on me with that one, but I'm most impressed by it. But the situation is, there are some recent stats that you researched and sent to me shows that we do have occasion when workers need to unite and say, no, we're not happy with this. We're going to take a little bit of time off until you get yourselves better organised. But generally speaking, those types of conversations that you mentioned in the early days, where you can sit down with your employer and just come to a fair and equitable middle, that seems to be the new norm for Australian workplaces, rather than the angriness of the 70s and 80s that I lived through.
Funny you should mention it, actually, Robin. Like, if we have a look back, Robert, even just to March, say, 2016, so that's not even 10 years ago, if you looked at March 2016, around Australia, yes, it's Australia-wide, there was 93 cases of dispute action, so 93. If you look at March 2024, there's only 48. And so we've nearly halved the amount of strike action in the last 8 years, which is really interesting, or disputes, as they say here. And if you look at the number of people affected, those stats have changed accordingly too. So in 2016, 24,000 and a half people, involved in the dispute. And then in 2024, it's down to 12,800. And so we nearly halved both the number of disputes and the number of people involved. Now, that's an interesting thing. But just back to your point, where do we actually talk more? I think unions have still got their place, absolutely, because I hear in my work about times where employers don't pay correctly, don't have safe workplaces. Like, absolutely, there's a time and a place. Though I think at the same time, I think the 2024 organisation is probably, even the big ones that are very unionised, are probably different, or I hope they are different organisations to say even 7 years or 8 years ago in the 2016-17. Because, you and I both know, and we've talked about this a lot, whether it's psychological safety, whether it's engagement, whether it's participation in the workforce, whether it's all the I guess the let's say new age leadership stuff that's happening in the last probably 4 or 5 years, inclusion and diversity. Things are changing, and I think the industrial dispute graph that's trending downwards is probably just a reflection of society in general and leadership in general, organisations in general. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, what I find interesting is most of the disputes that go to the stage of strike or near strike seem to be worker bodies related to government organisation. It's the government seems to be the ones that are holding out most on workers, because I've spoken to you before. I've lived in privileged workplaces, and I know that my current employer values their employees. They treat them accordingly, and everyone works in a happy and productive environment. And I think most bigger organisations get that. But it's interesting that it's nurses and police and ambulances that are government bodies. They're the ones who seem most aggrieved at the moment.
And isn't that sad? Even, like, let's just put a really high-level view on that. It's sad that the people that do the most important work in our community are the people that have to strike.
Teachers, childcare workers, nurses, and ambulance drivers. They're the ones who I think really have their nose to the grindstone more than most, and I think they're undervalued.
Oh, beautifully put, undervalued. How well said. And I'm just looking at a graph at the moment that looks at some of the highest, I guess, industries that strike the most. And you go construction and then transport, and then guess what? You just put it beautifully. The third highest on the list is education and training, health, care and social assistance. So you're right. And I'm just thinking about my own personal experience. My lovely wife was a school teacher for 18 years and would never have not paid her union fee. She said, Anton, as a teacher, you have to be protected because the unions are there if we ever need them. If something happens with a parent or with a staff, you can rely on the support from the union. So I get that. It's sort of really all dropping for me as part of this conversation as you and I talk through it, just how the people in our community that do the most important work probably have to strike the most, which when you look at it is a really sad situation. It's probably a sad indictment of our society that we can't value and care for those people as much as we do in, say, private enterprise, if a lot of those workers are sort of government-based.
Yeah, and we talk a lot in the show about gender inequality, and certainly the female membership of those groups is much higher than others as well. And I sometimes wonder whether people's passion is tapped into for the wrong reasons, because people know that nurses will continue to turn up because they're passionate. Childcare workers will continue to turn up because they're passionate, and with teachers, and that might be the case of, it doesn't matter if we don't pay them enough. They're going to keep turning up anyway because they love their jobs and they know it's important. I hope that's not the case, but sometimes it looks that way.
Yeah, and that's right. And perception is everything, right? And as you and I both know, and those let's call it passion. Why do we just have to expect people that do heart-based work to do the toughest work and then not reward them and not value them for it? And whether that's the case or not, like you say, it's perceived that way. Just look at the wages, and you think a lot of those areas or those roles that you and I both talked about then, they're probably lower paid compared to, like you have a look at, let's say mining, let's say manufacturing, let's say construction. And then even transport and postal and warehousing, they're the first four industries that come up when we're looking at industries that were involved in strike action. They're probably the most highest paid sectors in Australia. But then obviously the education and training and healthcare and those sorts of sectors are probably the lowest paid. So, why is it? And that's probably a bigger question, actually. That's probably a research paper. Why is it that those workers probably feel undervalued? Because if it looks from the outside that they probably feel the same. Because one of the biggest ways to recognise humans, as you know, is to remunerate them accordingly and effectively and at a reasonable rate for the work that they're doing. And so, how do we change? And unions probably ask this question and probably gone on a mission potentially to say we will change the societal norm that these people shouldn't be the least paid. Maybe it's a gender thing. Maybe that glass ceiling comes into this as well.
It might also be just the power of the union to collectively negotiate, but it does seem odd. And before I say this, I'm going to say this is not meant to denigrate anybody. It's certainly not the case. Anyone who's working deserves to be remunerated. However, if someone is on a lollipop stick directing traffic, getting $100,000 a year plus, and someone looking after our aged persons and our children and our youth are getting around 50 or less, something's not quite right, Anton.
Oh, with you, Robert Cameron. Absolutely. And then when we put it like that, sometimes there's an argument to say, well, what do these groups of workers have to fall back on to actually influence their employers, whoever that may be, whether it's government or whether it's, a non-for-profit or whoever it happens to be? How do they? What voice do they have? And if they have to lean on unions, well, maybe that's the right option or avenue. But I think let's put it out there, and whatever we can do as a society to recognise those humans who do the most important work in our communities, let's make sure we recognise them with suitable remuneration. And you can nearly compare it to other countries. I don't know what other countries are like, but I'm guessing they're similar to Australia, that those heartfelt jobs are probably the least paid, which is a real shame, isn't it, when you think about it? And I didn't know we'd end up there today, but you're right.
Yeah, it is interesting. Now, all in all, we've talked about a little sadness, but the cost of living pressures are still hurting a lot of people. But generally, as you get around the place, do we have a happy Australian workforce and a good relationship with their employers?
In general terms, in very, very general terms, I'm going to say in my experience, I'm going to say more yes than no. Now, what I mean by that is we're lucky at the Guinea Group. We get to work with more high-performing teams than, and I'll say this with love, like you just did before, in inverted commas said with love, is teams in turmoil. So, my experience as a consultant, as a coach, as a trainer is, like I've got a group of today, and you can hear them in the background milling around probably. We've got a group of people from different industries around town, and we did a quick session this morning about, where is your leadership skills, and they're all sort of 4 out of 5 or 3 out of 5. And, I've got a group today who is probably a group of high-performing leaders from about 6 different industries, and we just put it out to the world. And the people that come to our programs are more engaged, interested, inspired, and probably inspirational. So I see that side of it more than I see the teams in turmoil. So I always say 75% of our work is high-performing teams where organisations are getting it right, 25% of the teams in turmoil, and we've got 1 or 2 of those teams that we're working with as well. But in general, but remember, you and I both speak pretty regularly, and it's a privilege. And my demeanour, I guess, is probably towards the positive. I talk people. My mission on the planet, Robert Cameron, is to leave people better than I found them. You
do that very well here.
Oh, thank you. Back at you. Back at you.
No, that's very good. I'll let you get back to your folk. I can tell they're just busting for your next pearl of wisdom, and we are going to continue on. I look forward to our next chat. Bye. Thanks again, mate. Really appreciate your time. Always in a tight situation. We'll get you down here one day for a live in studio, I hope.
Thanks, Robert. Speak soon, mate.
Best wishes.